Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on But Crime Does Punish by Johnaides. I absolutely love this book. I thought it was a marvelous short novel and has a really interesting point of view. The main character is an archivist, this very old archivist, who's addressing questions and answering questions and telling stories to you, the reader. You're addressed in the second person. And you want to know something. You want to know who betrayed your father decades ago. Who betrayed your father, which led to his death. When Czechoslovakia was under control by the Soviet Union, there was a state police. This archivist has access to those old police records, those interrogation records, so you can find out the truth. But the price of that discovery is that this archivist is going to tell you his entire life story. Who was he? How did he get this job? Why has he stayed here for all these years? What were his opinions on the control, the totalitarian state when the Soviet Union was sort of overseeing then Czechoslovakia? And so Johanides gives us this really interesting point of view, this really interesting perspective. And What Spools is a very, very interesting story. I want to just give a sample of it. So the archivist recalls, I first met Vritiak at number 13, Tashkentska Street, in an enormous villa built in the final years of interwar Czechoslovakia during the Czechoslovak First Republic. We were both renting rooms in the house, but were not aware of each other. We'd never met until that moment, neither in the house nor out on the street. He goes on, a pair of shiny black shoes, the kind once known as brothel creepers that are no longer in fashion, with rounded toe caps and thick soles, and although I could clearly see the shoes, the ankles and the socks, and the slightly too short trousers above them, my unconscious automatic reaction, without the slightest hesitation, was to refuse to believe that a pair of legs ending in black shoes could possibly be dangling there, just a couple meters in front of me. I refused to believe my own eyes. That's something you learn inside. I looked away. The reflex that my head had cultivated for years was still in perfect working order. It immediately convinced me that what I was seeing was just some suspended bits of fabric. And he goes on to describe this story, and he says later, except that once I had trained myself to revel in mirages, to hope that this, that, or the other might be possible after all, I couldn't kick the habit. I wasn't able to rid myself of this scar, this physical defect that had corroded my soul. I had taught myself to see only what I wanted to see, and this shadow, which I had myself created under the pressure of Valdish, had become a faithful, constant companion of my real shadow. Just try to think this through and imagine what it means to see only what you want to see. Can you understand that? In a way, this was a kind of training to prepare me for what I would see once I was out of prison. You see, the camera of the human eye needs to be trained, and then retrained again, in accordance with the latest party line. Do you follow me, Mr. Clementini? And that gives you a sense of how he rolls through this. You're addressed periodically by your name, Mr. Clementini. Other times you're just addressed as you, or he goes on to tell a new story. And so there's a rambling, monologuing nature. You're never allowed to actually ask your questions. There are times where the story breaks, and it's very clear that it's assumed that the reader has asked a question to this archivist, but he doesn't. You don't get to ask your question. There's a paragraph break, and he then goes and it tells a new story in response to that question. And so it's very interesting. That idea, though, within there of these ways that he has taken his experiences, that he was imprisoned for a while, that he was tortured in prison and mutilated. Those are real, and just tiny little details. At another point, he tells a very interesting perspective in terms of how an authority figure, his superior, viewed life under this totalitarian state. Suddenly the colonel declared, "What's the point of stuffing animals? It's unspeakably sad. Stuffing animals, taxidermy, isn't there something incredibly hideous about that?" Then he leaned close to me and asked in a whisper, "What if all these animals were party members? And that's what is preventing them from moving. They can't make a move because they've been stuffed by the Communist Party and the government." I froze and let out a scream. I remember it was a wordless scream, like when you're having teeth pulled. I was overcome by horror and bewilderment, for I realized that the colonel's provocative question was insidious in a premeditated and deliberate way. And there's this sense of dread that exists across But Crime Does Punish. The archivist continually, his life has had many, many challenges, many just absolutely sad and awful moments. But it's clear that he exists in a society where so many individuals have these. He is a microcosm of the universal dread that existed. And Mr. Clementini, the you addressed to the reader, is haunted by this as well. He's haunted by the fact that his father and mother disappeared, that they were executed under this totalitarian society. And so who betrayed his father? Who was the traitor? Was it possibly his own mother? Was it someone he knew? Was it someone who's nameless and has just disappeared? That's the answer he keeps craving. And that the archivist is hinting towards and guiding towards, but never quite actually giving you exactly what you want to know. But we have those moments, though, that reveal just how frightening life could be, and the details in which there was this hollow bureaucracy around them. The book was was published in the mid-1990s after the dissolution of Czechoslovakia in Slovakia itself. And he goes on to describe little details about how folks in Bratislava might feel about the power structure of Czechoslovakia being in Prague and not really being there in their land where they wanted it. And feeling like they were sort of distant and not only overtopped by Soviet and communist officials, but overtopped then by Czech officials within this theoretical Czechoslovakia. And so Johanides gives us all these different feelings, but he also has moments that can be bizarre and strange and almost comic in terms of how strange the events are. So at one point, the narrator's telling that they come in and they start seizing archives. So I swung a leg over the side and got under the tarpaulin. Light was provided by 3 carbide lamps. A pile of Spiš Borovica bottles lay on a folded blanket. And something was splashing about inside 2 yellow plastic 10-liter gas canisters. A rubber hose was wrapped around one of them. Another hose submerged in a 3rd canister was passed around from mouth to mouth. Each of the men, there were about a dozen of them sitting there, took a swig from the canister and squeezed the end of the hose tight before passing it to the next man. Finally, it was my turn. It was homemade Slivovitz. At least as strong as the Kirsch we're drinking now. After a while, I had a powerful sense that the faces of all these men on the lorry reminded me of some people. They resembled men I knew only too well from somewhere. I could have sworn blind that I'd come across these people somewhere before. Meanwhile, the hose came around again, and that's when I realized that in this light, there was something about these men that made them resemble in some fundamental, crucial way the warders in Valdish at the time of Stalin's death. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I thought it must be some kind of black magic, that I was hallucinating, that I was befuddled and seeing things. I placed my hand on my holster, craned my neck, and stared into their faces, into each of these men's faces, one by one, fixing each of them for at least 5 seconds. And I was gripped by a sense of horror, as if on the verge of paralysis, just like the day Stalin died. The same despair, the same dreadful fear, the same crass grief was imprinted on every single one of these faces, like an indelible official stamp. And so it is a fascinating novel. The ending is just absolutely incredible. I'm so impressed by this book. It's the first novel I've read from Slovakia. It's translated by Julia and Peter Sherwood, who I believe also did the translation of Pavel Vilikovsky's Fleeting Snows. I may want to read that as well, but this was fantastic. I'm looking forward to reading more works. I think they're sort of, they have a little press. It's the Klíma press, but it's modern Slovak classics. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of these. Certainly, I was reminded of a work by Kafka in the Penal Colony came to mind, but even some of the other works before the law, some of the other works that get that sense of dread of being a person in this machine that is just oppressive, and the innovative technique from the point of view I thought was great. In terms of the fear of totalitarian states, I think A Tomb for Boris Davidovich by Danilo Kish would be one of the great ones. I'll link my video to this book in the description box below. Certainly Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. The Joke by Milan Kundera, the late Milan Kundera, is very much getting at this same idea of a man imprisoned for a joke under that communist rule. Certainly Stefan Zweig's chess story gets at the sort of oppressive nature to an individual's psyche, and the way that dread and fear creep in and sort of almost rewire a person, the way that the narrator was describing in But Crime Does Punish. The monologuing narrator who's telling these stories and recounting things certainly recalls narrators from Thomas Bernhard. I was thinking of Old Masters, in part because I sort of read these back to back, certainly, or Faulkner's Absalom with Quentin Compton sort of telling these stories to Shreve and or sort of not Ellen telling the stories to Quentin and Quentin's roommate Shreve, and sort of the way that narrative is addressed from this one particular point of view. Additionally, I thought of Rogue Mail by Jeffrey Household. This takes a very different tack, but the nature of fear, the nature of trying to escape and of being dehumanized in that process of fear, I thought was very close. The philosophies and sort of point of view that David Goodis presents in many of his novels, which are very grim, sort of noir qualities, felt close. A little more spy, adventure, would be Funeral in Berlin by Deighton, but this I felt was fairly close in tone. Of John le Carré's books, maybe the Spy Who Came In From the Cold is closer. And then finally, I was thinking a little bit of Sufferings of Prince Sternenhoch by Ladislav Klíma, particularly with the narrator who's just constantly addressing things out from this reality and not answering the questions that need to be answered, holding on to secrets while unspooling this other story. I thought was quite interesting. So this was But Crime Does Punish. I really, really enjoyed it. So I'd highly recommend it. Hope everybody's doing well. Thank you.